A lot of people have been providing reflections on the life and contributions of Paul Volcker, and David Kotak, in one of his most recent commentaries, had some interesting observations about his own personal experiences with Paul, and it occurred to me maybe it'd be useful and interesting to share a few of my own experiences. It turns out that I was on the staff of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. from 1976 to 1981, which meant that I overlapped three chairmen at that point in time. They were all governors, of course, and that included the last segments of Arthur Burns' tenure as chairman of the Federal Reserve, as well as the entire tenure of G. William Miller, and then Paul Volcker, who came in. A lot of people sort of tend to forget that Paul really wasn't a stranger, was not a stranger to the Federal Reserve, because at the time he was appointed chairman, he was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which meant that he routinely attended all of the FOMC meetings during his tenure as president of the New York Fed, and also served as vice chairman for the FOMC at that same period of time. So he was deeply involved in monetary policy and was not a stranger either to the Federal Reserve or what was going on when it came to policy. And of course, remember, this was a period of time when inflation was accelerating, due in large part to the policies of Arthur Burns that had been put in place. And Volcker came in with very strong views as to what his predilections were in terms of appropriate policy and where interest rates should be. And he was strongly an advocate of trying to bring inflation down and restore normal functioning in financial markets. By the time he came into office, it also, if you go back and read the minutes and descriptions of what happened at FOMC meetings, the FOMC was not pursuing a federal funds rate target per se, but rather was following both changes in the monetary aggregates and setting desired percentage increases on an annual basis for M1, M2, and M3, as a matter of fact. So that policy expression was coupled with what they expected the federal funds rate to be if, in fact, monetary growth took place at that particular rate of increase that they had specified in their public documents. So Volcker came in and very shortly thereafter embarked upon a policy that essentially put aside the target rate for the federal funds and focused primarily on the monetary aggregates. Now, it so happens at that point in time, I was not involved in monetary policy at the Federal Reserve. I was a senior staff officer in charge of essentially all the research that wasn't related to monetary policy, which included things like payment system research, research in support of the Division of Bank Supervision, and consumer affairs as well. So I was a little bit surprised that in late 1979, which was shortly thereafter Volcker had taken responsibilities as chairman, I got called along with one of my colleagues to come to his office. And in the office was Paul Volcker and another senior staff person, Steve Axelrod. Steve Axelrod was the staff director for monetary policy. He didn't have his own staff, but in fact had carte blanche ability to tap the resources in any of the research divisions, the Division of Research as well as the Division of International Finance. Everything that went to the board through to the FOMC went through Steve Axelrod at that point in time. That's not the way things work now, but that's the way it worked at that point in time. So I was in the office with my colleague and Steve and Paul Volcker. And Volcker said he was concerned about how much pressure the money center banks could take on their capital position should interest rates start to skyrocket. This was preliminary discussions, as it turned out, for the policy that they were going to be pursuing. We were told to come up with estimates as to how much pressure the money center banks could take, and then try to help him understand what the financial stability risks would be should interest rates start to skyrocket. The odd thing was we were told not to tell anybody else that we were working on this project. Now, as senior staff in the research division, that put me in a fairly difficult position because I was working at that point in time with another governor, Chuck Partee, who was in charge of the board's activities related to the Bank Examination Council, which was an interagency group designed to essentially harmonize bank examination policies. And of course, this was an issue that was directly related to Partee's responsibility. So we were put in a pretty difficult situation, especially since the culture of the board at that point in time was that you worked for the Board of Governors. You didn't work for one particular governor or whatever. It was your responsibilities were to the Board of Governors as an institution. Well, obviously, a lot happened following the change in the Federal Reserve's policies, and we tend to forget how much unrest there was at that point in time. But I can remember parades of farmers with tractors up and down Constitution Avenue protesting the Fed's rate policies. Gail Sincata, who was a Chicago consumer activist, came and had special meetings with Volcker about concerns for housing and minority communities and everything else that were being pressured because of the interest rate policy. The Board of Governors received tons of 2x4s, 18 inches in length, sent from various builders and consumers around the country that said that this was from the house that wasn't built. This is from the business that wasn't built, as a way of protest. Now, as an aside, sort of interesting, you would think that those would be fairly useless items, but it turns out that the Board of Governors offices, each one had a fireplace, and so those 2x4s were put to good use in those fireplaces as a way of economizing, and they got a little bit of heat out of that submission in any case. I can also remember that there were tons of nail kegs that the board received, each one filled with keys from the cars that weren't sold and from the houses that weren't sold. So this was a very tumultuous time, but one in the end that Volcker, despite all the heat that he took, both from the president, from Congress, from the public, was in fact successful. And we have to give him a lot of credit for sticking to his guns. He personally was under attack. I know for a fact from talking to friends that he was even reluctant to go out to dinner because, of course, he was an easy person to recognize because of his height, and people would come up to his dinner table and harangue him over his policies, complaining about what was done. So he had a lot of personal sacrifices that he made as part of that whole process. He was interested and involved, however, in other things besides monetary policy, and he had particular views when it came to what banking structure and financial market structure should look like. Indeed, I can remember working on a project that was focused on whether bank holding companies should be allowed to acquire thrift institutions or not. He was against that. He was against merging thrift institutions. Remember, this was the time of the thrift crisis, and his view was the more you could balkanize and separate segments in the financial markets, if there should be some sort of financial crisis, not all of the segments would go down with each other. And so he was strongly in favor of segmenting financial markets and not allowing banking organizations and bank holding companies to expand their powers. Now, interestingly enough, that view surfaced many, many years later when the Dodd-Frank bill was passed, And the so-called Volcker Rule was included in that act. The Volcker Rule was designed to prevent banks from engaging in proprietary trading and speculation in derivatives and options and other financial instruments. Again, rooted in his view that the more you could segment financial markets and keep them independent of each other, the more flexibility the markets would have if it came to times and periods of financial crisis. So his view did not change. Even 20 years later, after he was long gone from the Federal Reserve, he still held some of these views when it came to market structure, and we're living with those today. Just one last sort of observation in terms of how things worked at the Federal Reserve. Volcker was, as a person, very congenial, very easy to talk to. He was a person who interacted with the staff, but in fact, when it actually came to key policy decisions, there were only 2 or 3 people that he relied upon on any consistent basis. One was a person he brought with him from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for about, and the person stayed there for about a year. His name was Jerry Corrigan. Jerry was a senior officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He became, shortly after, he spent a year at the Board of Governors assisting Volcker. He became president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He also then became president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So he went back to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And it also turns out he was married to another Federal Reserve Bank president, Cathy Minahan, who was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So Jerry was a very close confidant, and everything went, particularly for the time that he was there, but even continually, he had the chairman's ear and spent a lot of time as a close confidant of Paul Volcker. Another person was Mike Bradfield. Mike Bradfield was the general counsel, and he was brought in by Paul Volcker. They had known each other for a long period of time. Bradfield was very important as a confidant at the board. Bradfield, however, had trouble adapting to the culture at the Federal Reserve Board because he didn't understand what it meant to operate in an institution that wasn't controlled by lawyers. It was controlled actually by economists. And so he had some trouble. As a reflection of that, it turns out that he went to the Kansas City Fed conference in Jackson Hole, and his first visit there, he went on a raft trip with First Day, which was customary. A lot of people did that. And in the course of the raft trip, it was pretty rough. He fell overboard and he lost his glasses, and he really needed his glasses to function effectively. I had about 5 staff people claim they were the ones who pushed him in. So it was a case where that was an indication of where he fit in the hierarchy of the Federal Reserve. It turns out that he and Volcker had a long relationship, and Bradfield was, in fact, a key person when it came to identifying dormant bank accounts in Swiss banks that had been dormant because of persecution from the Nazis. He was involved in a lot of other policy actions as well. So this was a case where this was a long-lasting friendship, but again, symptomatic of what I said to begin with, that Volcker tended to rely primarily on a very close-knit group of people to act as advisors and sounding boards for the policies that he was pursuing. I was fortunate enough not too long ago, maybe about 5 years ago, to have a chance to sit down with Paul in a break situation at a conference that was being held at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. We had a really nice conversation. He was a perfect gentleman, and he remembered some of the things that we had talked about and experiences there. But he was just very much of a gentleman, very easy person to talk to. And I was pleased because I was just a staff member at that point in time. But to be able to sit down with someone like that and have that kind of conversation, I think, was very memorable to me, and I'll never forget the man.